Part 1, Chapter 8b of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Reading by Mary Rohde. Part 1, The Man in the Case. Chapter 8b, The Man Higher Up, continued. It was all there, all except the proof. And the proof. He laughed aloud suddenly, unpleasantly. There seemed something sardonic in it. Aye, more than that, all that was grim in irony. The proof, in Stangeist's own writing, sworn to before witnesses in the presence of a notary. The text of the document, of course, unknown to both witnesses and notary. Evidence, absolute and final, that would be admitted in any court, for Stangeist was a lawyer and would see to that, was in Stangeist's own safe, for Stangeist's own protection. Stangeist, who was himself the head and brains of this murder gang. Stangeist, who was the man higher up. It was amazing, without parallel in the history of crime, and yet ingenious, clever, full of the craft and cunning that had built up the shyster lawyer's reputation below the deadline. Jimmie Dale's lips were curiously thin now. So it was Stangeist. A Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde with a vengeance. He knew Stangeist, not personally, not by the reputation Stangeist held, low even as that was, among his brother members of the profession, but as the man was known for what he really was among the crooks and criminals of the underworld, where, in that strange underground exchange, whispered confidences passed between those whose common enemy was the law, where Larry the Bat himself was trusted in the innermost circles. Stangeist was a power in the Badlands. There were few among that unholy community that Stangeist, at one time or another, in one way or another, had not rescued from the clutches of the law, resorting to any trick or cunning, but with perjury that he could handle like the master of it that he was, employed as the most common weapon of defense for his clients, provided he were paid well enough for it. The man had become more than the attorney for the crime world. He had become part of it. Cunning, shrewd, crafty, conscienceless, cold-blooded. That was Stangeist. The form and features of the man pictured themselves in Jimmie Dale's mind. The 6-foot muscular frame that was invariably clothed in attire of the most fashionable cut. The thin lips with their oily, plausible smile. The straight black hair that straggled into pinpoint. Little black eyes. The dark face with its high cheekbones, which, with the pronounced aquiline nose and the persistent rumor that he was a quarter caste, had led the underworld, prejudiced always in favor of a moniker, to dub the man the Indian Chief. Jimmie Dale laughed again, still unpleasantly. So Stangeist had taken the plunge at last and branched out into a wider field, had he? Well, there was nothing surprising in that, except that he had not done it before. The irony of it lay in the fact that at last he had been too clever, overstepped himself in his own cleverness, that was all. It was Australian Ike, the Mope, and Clarie Deane that Stangeist had gathered around him, the Tocsin had said. And there were none worse in Larry the Bat's wide range of acquaintanceship than those three. Stangeist had made himself master of Australian Ike, the Mope, and Clarie Deane, and he had driven them a little too hard on the division of the spoils, and laughed at them, and cracked the whip much after the fashion that the trainer in the cage handles the growling beasts around him. A dozen of the crimes that had appalled and staggered New York they had committed under his leadership, and then it seemed they had quarreled furiously, the three pitted against Stangeist, threatening him, demanding a more equitable share of the proceeds. None was better aware than Stangeist that threats from men of their caliber were likely to result in a grim aftermath, and Stangeist yesterday, the Tocsin said, had answered them as no other man than Stangeist would either have thought of or have dared to do. One by one, at separate times, covering the other with the revolver, Stangeist had permitted them to read a document that was addressed to the district attorney. It was a confession, complete in every detail, of every crime the four together had committed, implicating Stangeist as fully and unreservedly as it did the other three. It required no commentary. If anything happened to Stangeist, a stab in the dark, for instance, a bullet from some dark alleyway, a blackjack deftly wielded, as only Australian Ike the Mope or Clarie Deane knew how to wield it, the document automatically became a death sentence for Australian Ike the Mope and Clarie Deane. It was very simple, and evidently it had been effective, as witnessed the renewal of their operations in the murder of Rossler that afternoon. Fear and avarice had both probably played their part. Fear of the man who would with such consummate nerve fling his life into the balance to turn the tables upon them, while he jeered at them. Avarice that prompted them to get what they could out of Stangeist's brains and leadership, and to be satisfied with what they could get, since they could get no more. Satisfied? Jimmie Dale shook his head. No, that was hardly the word. Cowed, perhaps, for the moment would be better. But afterward, with a document like that in existence, when they would never be safe for an instant, well, beasts in the cages had been known to get the better of the man with the whip, and beasts were gentle things compared with Australian Ike, the Mope, and Clarie Deane. Some day they would reverse the tables on the Indian chief, if they could, and if they couldn't, it would not be for the lack of trying. There would be another act in that drama of the house divided before the curtain fell, and there would be a sort of grim poetic justice in it, a temptation almost to let the play work itself out to its own inevitable conclusion, only Jimmie Dale, the final touches given to his features, stood up, and his hands clenched suddenly, fiercely. It was not just the man higher up alone, there were the other three as well, the whole four of them, all of them, crimes without number at their door, brutal, fiendish acts, damnable outrages, murder to answer for, with which the public now was beginning to connect the name of the Gray Seal. The Gray Seal! Jimmie Dale's hands, whose delicate fingers were artfully grimed and blackened now beneath the nails, clenched still tighter, and then, with a quick shrug of his shoulders, a thinning of the firmly compressed lips, he picked up the coat from where it lay upon the floor, put it on, put the money that was on the table in his pocket, and replaced the box under the flooring. In quick succession, from the same hiding place, an automatic, a black silk mask, an electric flashlight, that thin metal box like a cigarette case, and a half a dozen vicious-looking little blue steel burglar's tools were stowed away in his pockets, the flooring carefully replaced, the oilcloth spread back again, and then, pulling a slouch hat well down over his eyes, he reached up to turn off the gas. For an instant his hand held there, while his eyes, sweeping around the apartment, took in every single detail about him in that same alert, comprehensive way as when he had entered. Then the room was in darkness, and the Gray Seal, as Larry the Bat, a shuffling, unkempt creature of the underworld, alias Jimmie Dale, the lionized of clubs, the matrimonial target of exclusive drawing-rooms, closed the door of the sanctuary behind him, shuffled down the stairs, shuffled out into the lane, and shuffled along the street toward the Bowery. A policeman on the corner accosted him familiarly. "Hello, Larry," grinned the officer. "Hello," returned Jimmie Dale affably through the side of his mouth. "Fine night, ain't it?" and shuffled on along the street. And now Jimmie Dale began to hurry, still with that shuffling tread, but covering the ground nevertheless with amazing celerity. He had lost no time since receiving the Tocsin's letter, it was true, but for all that it was now after 10 o'clock. Stangeist's house was dark that evening, she had said, meaning that the occupants, Stangeist as well as whatever servants there might be, for Stangeist had no family, were out, the servants in town for a theatre or picture show probably, and Stangeist himself as yet not back, presumably from the Roessler affair. The stub of an old cigar, unlighted, shifted with a sudden, savage twist of the lips from one side of Jimmie Dale's mouth to the other. There was need for haste. There was no telling when Stangeist might get back. As for the servants, that did not matter so much. Servants in suburban homes had a marked affinity for last trains. Jimmie Dale boarded a crosstown car, effected a transfer, and in a quarter of an hour after leaving the sanctuary was huddled, an inoffensive heap like a tired-out working-man, in a corner seat of a Long Island train. From here there was only a short run ahead of him, and 20 minutes later, descending from the train at Forest Hills, he had passed through the more thickly settled portion of the little place and was walking briskly out along the country road. Stangeist's house lay approximately a mile and a half from the station, quite by itself, and set well back from the road. Jimmie Dale could have found it with his eyes blindfolded. The Tocsin's directions had lacked none of their usual explicit minuteness. The road was quite deserted. Jimmie Dale met no one. Even in the houses that he passed, the lights were in nearly every instance already out. Something, merciless in its rage, swept suddenly over Jimmie Dale, as, unbidden, of its own volition, the last paragraph he had read in that evening's paper began to repeat itself over and over again in his mind. The two little kiddies. It seemed as though he could see them standing there, and from Jimmie Dale's lips, not given to profanity, there came a bitter oath. It might possibly be that even if he were successful in what was before him tonight, the authors of the Roessler murder would never be known. That confession of Stangeist's was written prior to what had happened that afternoon, and there would be no mention, naturally, of Roessler. And for a moment that seemed to Jimmie Dale the one thing paramount to all others, the one thing that was vital. Then he shook his head and laughed out shortly. After all, it did not matter. Whether Stangeist and the blood wolves he had gathered around him paid the penalty specifically for one particular crime or for another could make little difference. They would pay, just as surely, just as certainly, once that paper was in his possession. Jimmie Dale was counting the houses as he passed. They were more infrequent now, farther apart. Stangeist was no fool, not the fool that he would appear to be for keeping a document like that, once he had had the temerity to execute it, in his own safe. For, in a day or two, the Tocsin had hinted at this, after holding it over the heads of Australian Ike, the Mope, and Clary Deane again to drive the force of it a little deeper home, he would undoubtedly destroy it. And the supposition that it was still in existence would have equally the same effect on the minds of the other three. Stangeist was certainly alive to the peril that he ran with such a thing in his possession, only the peril had not appealed to him as imminent either from the three thugs with whom he had allied himself, or much less from anyone else, that was all. Jimmie Dale halted by a low, ornamental stone fence, some 3 feet high, and stood there for a moment, glancing about him. This was Stangeist's house. He could just make out the building as it loomed up a shadowy, irregular shape, perhaps 200 yards back from the fence. The house was quite dark. Not a light showed in any window. Jimmie Dale sat down casually on the fence, looked carefully again up and down the road. Then, swinging his legs over, quick now in every action, he dropped to the other side and stole silently across the grass to the rear of the house. Here he stopped again, reached up to a window that was about on a level with his shoulders, and tested its fastenings. The window, it was the window of Stangeist's private sanctum, according to the plan in her letter, was securely locked. Jimmie Dale's hands went into his pocket, and the black silk mask was slipped over his face. He listened intently. Then a little steel instrument began to gnaw like a rat. A minute passed, 2 of them. Again Jimmie Dale listened. There was not a sound save the night sounds, the light breeze whispering through the branches of the trees, the far-off rumble of a train, the whir of insects, the hoarse croaking of a frog from some nearby creek or pond. The window sash was raised an inch, another, and gradually to the top. Like a shadow, Jimmie Dale pulled himself up to the sill, and, poised there, his hands parted the heavy portieres that hung within. It was too dark to distinguish even a single object in the room. He lowered himself to the floor and slipped cautiously between the portieres. From somewhere in the house a clock began to strike. Jimmie Dale counted the strokes. 11 o'clock. It was getting late, too late. Stangeist was likely to be back any moment. The flashlight, in Jimmie Dale's hand now, circled the room with its little round white ray, lingering an instant in a queer, inquisitive sort of way here and there on this object and that, and went out. Jimmie Dale nodded. The flat desk in the center of the floor, the safe in the corner by the rear wall, the position of everything in the room, even to the chairs, was photographed on his mind. He stepped from the portieres to the safe, and the flashlight played again, this time reflecting back from the glistening nickeled knobs. Jimmie Dale's lips tightened. It was a small safe, almost ludicrously small. But to such height as the art of safe design had been carried, that design was embodied in the one before him. "Type K428 Colby," muttered Jimmie Dale. "A nasty little beggar, and it's 11 o'clock now. I'd use soup for once, if it weren't that it would put Stangeist wise and give him a chance to make his getaway before the district attorney got the nippers on the 4 of them." The light went out. Jimmie Dale dropped to his knees, and while his left hand passed swiftly, tentatively over the dials and handle, he rubbed the fingers of his right hand rapidly to and fro over the carpet. Wonderful fingertips were those of Jimmie Dale, sensitive to an abnormal degree, and now, tingling with the friction, the nerves throbbing at the skin surface, they closed in a light, delicate touch upon the knob of the dial, and Jimmie Dale's ear pressed close against the face of the safe. Time passed. The silence grew heavy, seemed to palpitate through the room. Then a deep breath, half like a sigh, half like a fluttering sob of a strong man taxed to the uttermost of his endurance, came from Jimmie Dale, and his left hand swept away the sweat beads that had spurted to his forehead. 8, 13, 22, whispered Jimmie Dale. There was a click, a low metallic thud as the bolt slid back, and the door swung open. And now the flashlight again, searching the mechanism of the inner door. Then darkness once more. 5 minutes, 10 minutes went by. The clock struck again, and the single stroke seemed to boom out through the house in a weird, raucous, threatening note, and seemed to linger, throbbing in the air. The inner door was open. The flashlight's ray was flooding a nest of pigeonholes and little drawers. The pigeonholes were crammed with papers, as presumably, too, were the drawers. Jimmie Dale sucked in his breath. He had already been there well over half an hour. Every minute now, every second, was counting against him, and to search that mass of papers before Stangeist returned was Ah! It came in a fierce little ejaculation from Jimmie Dale. From the center pigeonhole, almost the first paper he had touched, he drew a long, sealed envelope, and at a single swift glance had read the inscription upon it, written in longhand: To the District Attorney, New York City. Important. Urgent. The words in the corners were underscored 3 times. Swiftly, deftly, Jimmie Dale's hands rolled the rounded end of one of his collection of the legal instruments under the flap of the envelope, turned the sheets over, and drew out the folded document inside. There were 8 sheets of legal foolscap, neatly fastened together at the top left-hand corner with green tape. He opened them out, read a few words here and there, and turned the pages hurriedly over to scrutinize the last one, and nodded grimly. 3 witnesses had testified to the signature of Stangeist, and a notary's seal, accompanied by the usual legal formula, was duly affixed. Jimmie Dale slipped the document into his pocket, and, with the envelope in his hand, moved to the desk. He opened first one drawer and then another, and finally, discovering a pile of blank foolscap, took out 4 sheets, folded them, and placed them in the envelope, sealing the flap of the latter again. That it did not seal very well now brought a quizzical twitch to Jimmie Dale's lips. Sealed or unsealed, perhaps it made little difference. But for all that, he was not through with it yet. Apart from bringing the 4 to justice, there was, after all, a chance to vindicate the Gray Seal in this matter at least, and repudiate the newspaper theory which the public, to whom the Gray Seal was already a monster of iniquity, would seize upon with avidity. There was no further need of light now. Jimmie Dale replaced the flashlight in his pocket, took out the thin metal case, opened it, and with the tiny pair of tweezers that likewise nestled there, lifted out one of the gray, diamond-shaped paper seals. There was no question but that, once under arrest, Stangeist's effects would be immediately and thoroughly searched by the authorities. Jimmie Dale's smile from quizzical became ironic. It would afford the police another little bewildering reminder of the Gray Seal, and give Carruthers, good old Carruthers of the Morning News Argus, so innocently ignorant that the Gray Seal was his old college pal, yet the one editor of them all who was not forever barking and yelping at the Gray Seal's heels, a chance to vindicate himself a little too. Jimmie Dale moistened the adhesive side of the Gray Seal, and, still mindful of telltale fingerprints, laid it with the tweezers on the flap of the envelope, and pressed it firmly into place with his elbow. And then, suddenly, every faculty instantly on the alert, he snatched up the envelope from the desk and listened. Was it imagination, a trick of nerves, or— No, there it was again, a footfall on the gravel walk at the front of the house. The sound became louder, clearer, 2 footfalls instead of 1. It was Stangeist, and somebody was with him. In an instant Jimmie Dale was across the room and kneeling again before the safe. His fingers were flying now. The envelope shot back into the pigeonhole from which he had taken it. The inner door of the safe closed silently and swiftly. A dry chuckle came from Jimmie Dale's lips. It was just like fiction, just precisely time enough to have accomplished what he had come for before he was interrupted, not a second more or less, the villain foiled at the psychological moment. The key was rattling in the front door now. They were in the hall. He could hear Stangeist's voice. There came a dull glow from the hallway, following the click of an electric light switch. The outer door of the safe swung shut, the bolt slid into place, the dial whirled under Jimmie Dale's fingers. It was only a step to the portieres, the open window, and escape. He straightened up, stepped back, the portieres closed behind him, and the chuckle died on Jimmie Dale's lips. He was trapped, caught without so much as a corner in which to turn. Stangeist was even then coming into the room, and outside, darkly outlined, two forms stood just beneath the window. Instinctively, quick as a flash, Jimmie Dale crouched below the sill. Who were they? What did it mean? Questions swept in swift sequence through his brain. Had they seen him? It would be very dark against the background of the portieres, but yet, if they were watching... He drew a breath of relief. He had not been seen. Their voices reached him in low, guarded whispers. "Say, youse, Ike, pipe it! Dere's a window open in the snitch's room. Come on, we'll get in dere. It'll make the hair stand up on the back of his neck for a starter." "Aw, forget it," replied another voice. "Can the theayter stunt. Clarie leave the front door unfastened, don't he? And dey'll be in dere in a minute now. What you want to do, crab the game? You might hear us and fix Clarie before we had a chance, the skinny old fox. And here's the light now, see? Bait it on your toes for the front of the house." The room was flooded with light. Through the portieres that Jimmie Dale parted by the barest fraction of an inch, he could see Stangeist and another man, a thick-set, ugly-faced looking customer, Clarie Deane, according to that brief, whispered colloquy that he had heard outside. He looked again through the window. The two dark forms had disappeared now, but they had disappeared just a few seconds too late. With the two other men now in the room, and one of them so close that Jimmie Dale could almost have reached out and touched him, it was impossible to get through the window without being detected, when the slightest sound would attract instant attention and equally instant suspicion. It was a chance to be taken only as a last resort. Jimmie Dale's face grew hard, as his fingers closed around his automatic and drew the weapon from his pocket. It was all plain enough. That last act in the drama which he had speculatively anticipated was being staged with little loss of time, and in a grim sort of way the thought flashed across his mind that, perilous as his own position was, Stangeist at the moment was in even greater peril than himself. Australian Ike, the Mope, and Clarie Deane, given the chance, and they seemed to have made that chance now, were not likely to deal in half measures. Clarie Deane had dropped into a chair beside the desk, and the Mope and Australian Ike were creeping around to the front door. The parting in the portieres widened a little more, a very little more, slowly, imperceptibly, until Jimmie Dale, by the simple expedient of moving his head, could obtain an unobstructed view of the entire room. End of Part 1, Chapter 8, B.